My name is Riley. I'm 27, and probably if I met someone who once knew me now, he would say that I have become much calmer, more silent, more collected. But that's not quite true. There are still emotions raging inside me that I can't explain. And if someone had asked me why I became like this, would probably have said that it was my way. The path that I walked alone, without asking for advice or regretting anything. I remember every step, every moment that led me to who I became. And, probably, if I were offered to go back and live it all over again, would not do anything differently. My younger sister Ruby, with whom we grew up together in a house full of echoes of our parents' voices, was always the center of attention. Everyone was talking about her. She was the first everywhere, in sports, at school, in relationships. She was someone who was loved and admired. What about me? I've always been there for you. A shadow, a background. Not so bright, not so noticeable. But I've learned to accept it. Ruby was born in a sunny town where pine forests stretched to the horizon, and morning fog wrapped around the houses, as if trying to hide the familiar world from the eyes. This city, full of greenery and blooming gardens, was her ideal place. There was everything here, peace, comfort, and this place became the place where she could grow up without knowing failures. Every day of her life was like a holiday, like luck. She was like a bright star in the sky, to which all eyes were drawn. I didn't blame her for that, but sometimes it was hard to watch her parents pay attention to her every word, her every look, her every success. There was no need for me to try to be someone else. Everything in our house has always been relative. Mom and Dad obviously loved Ruby more, although they tried to hide it. But there was too much pain in my soul not to notice these things. They gave her expensive birthday presents, and gave her special parties. What about me? My birthday often merged with the Christmas holidays, becoming something insignificant, in the shadow of the holiday for everyone. I didn't have enough attention, I didn't have enough love. Not to complain. In order to understand what it's like to be invisible. I couldn't compete with Ruby. It was impossible. She was perfect. But I've always been sure of one thing: if anyone needed me, it was myself. This feeling of loneliness, which has grown into me since childhood, has become a part of me. But despite everything that happened in our house, I always stayed close. A shadow, but close. The first realization that our world is not just the house that seemed real to me came when I graduated from high school. Ruby entered a prestigious university. Her achievements were celebrated at every turn. She could afford any whim. What about me? I only had a high school diploma, which seemed to be nothing more than a piece of paper. But I didn't give up. No matter how much it seemed like the world belonged to Ruby, I still believed that my dreams were no less important. I chose a path that would seem strange to many: web design. It was new, unusual, but there was freedom in it. Freedom from the views, freedom from the opinions that persecuted me. I plunged into this world with my head. And when I received my first orders, when my work became visible to others, I felt that I was standing in my place. My parents didn't support me. They did not believe in this choice, they did not see a future in it. But I didn't give up. I continued to do what I thought was right. It was all in Ruby's shadow. But now that I look back, I realize that at some point I really stopped following her path and started going my own way. My loneliness has become my companion. And in this loneliness, when the whole world seemed to forget about my successes, I found myself. In this relentless search for what I need, what gives me strength, I have learned to appreciate my own achievements. It wasn't easy. My parents continued to focus on Ruby, and they might never have realized that I needed something more. But I didn't crave recognition. I longed for freedom. I wanted to feel like I could be someone, even if it was just me. I remember once, during one of my first big projects, my parents gave me a birthday present. It was a drawing kit, something completely different from what I expected. I didn't want to draw, I wanted to develop in the field of technology, in the field of design. But I took this gift as a sign. Not that they didn't understand me, but that I might have meant something to them after all. I didn't need much. It was just an understanding that my dreams weren't empty. Even if no one separated them. Even if no one has seen how proud I am of my achievements. Her path has always been an example to me, an example of how much can be achieved even in the most favorable conditions. Ruby never doubted herself, and her successes seemed inevitable. She was like a ray of sunlight sparkling against the background of gray everyday life, and I always looked at her as something unattainable, like a star that was impossible to reach. But now that I look back, I realize that Ruby wasn't simple. Her successes, her confidence, were all the result of being given things from the very beginning that I couldn't: confidence, attention, support. She couldn't be wrong, because she just wasn't allowed to do it. And I've learned from my mistakes. Every year I became more and more distant from home, from my family, from my parents. It was a strange feeling when a place that was supposed to be your refuge turns into something alien, into a burden. The house seemed like a prison to me, and every conversation with my parents was a test. They didn't understand my decisions, my desire for a career, for independence. My mother often said, "Why would you do that? You could just find a good husband, have children, and be happy." And I knew she sincerely believed in that. But that didn't suit me. I couldn't live up to other people's standards. I couldn't afford to be just a good wife and mother, as expected of me. It wasn't my path, it wasn't my destiny. I was striving for more. I always took responsibility, I was always ready for difficulties, even if they seemed insurmountable. My life was not about finding comfort, but about finding meaning. Maybe that's why I'm so immersed in my work. Design has become my world, my salvation. When I first came across web design, I was 19, and I immediately fell in love with this world. I felt my hands begin to create, my ideas taking shape. It was something incredible to work with code, design, and create something new that would live its life on the internet. However, in my home, in a family where Ruby's cult of success reigned, my decisions were met with misunderstanding. My parents couldn't understand how anyone could choose a career that didn't promise immediate financial success and stability. "You need to think about the future, Riley, and not chase empty dreams," my mother told me when I told her about my passion for design. But I was stubborn. I believed in myself, I believed in my strength, and I knew that if I put my whole soul into this work, it would definitely pay off. I spent years learning by myself. I devoted all my free minutes and vacations to online courses, studied programs, and improved my skills. While Ruby was enjoying her status as a beloved daughter, I increasingly felt that my home was a place where I was not understood, where I was not supported. And I started walking further away. Not physically, I still lived with them, but emotionally I was no longer a part of this family. The time that I used to spend with them, I now devoted to my training. And finally, the moment came when my efforts began to bear fruit. I was able to join the design team. It was a huge victory for me. I remember the moment when they told me that I had been hired. It was incredible. I could hardly believe it, but my enthusiasm and determination did not go unnoticed. I started working in a team, meeting with professionals, learning from the best. Of course, it was difficult. There were moments when it seemed to me that I couldn't stand it, that my strength was running out. But I couldn't afford to give up. I always knew that I could succeed if I persevered enough. And every day I became more confident in my work. I learned how to work with people, how to find a common language with those who were much more experienced and successful. It was difficult, but it was in these difficult situations that I felt my strength grow, as each new project is a step forward. I began to feel that I was finding my way, that I was finally living my life, and not the life that they tried to impose on me. My parents continued their attempts to convince me to return home, to do something normal. Mom continued to tell me anxiously that I had to find a man in order not to remain an old maid. But I didn't pay attention to it. I knew that my path was not the path according to their rules. And no matter how hard it was for me, I moved forward without looking back. My success wasn't instantaneous, but it was mine. And with every step, with every new project, I felt like I was building my own life, my own reality, where I could be who I wanted to be. My place in this world was not predetermined. I decided what it would be like. And despite everything that was happening around me, despite their misunderstanding, I knew one thing: I didn't need their approval. All I was looking for was my own success, my own achievements, and they didn't depend on other people's expectations. Ruby has never been a bad person. But something about her behavior always made me feel like a stranger, unnecessary, as if I were an extra element in her life. There were moments when she seemed to want to say something important, but couldn't. Back then, she often turned to me with simple requests, like, "Help me with this," or "Please do it for me." I was always ready to help, as if I was looking for an opportunity to find common ground in these little things, to see in her eyes at least a drop of the warmth that I so wanted to feel. Maybe it seemed to me that if I was useful to her, if I was around, it would somehow smooth out our contradictions. I hoped that my presence would at least slightly simplify her difficult journey into a world full of expectations, a world that she built around herself, filled with high achievements and a constant desire to be better. But every year it became more and more difficult for me to understand what was really going on in her head. We both grew up in the same house, but the world I fit into and Ruby's were so different. She was always the center of attention, and I couldn't help but notice how touched our parents were by her successes, how the whole world was always on her side. Everything she did, all her decisions were correct, all her choices were supported. And I was there, but I had to do everything on my own. My successes were rarely noticed, and my efforts were not appreciated. And it was hard. Ruby, as always, was detached. She was mostly immersed in her smartphone, reading something, writing messages, and I was sitting across from her, trying to establish a conversation. But no matter how hard I tried, she always remained cold. Every day I felt more and more alienation between us. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was painful. It was as if we were two completely different people, with different worlds, with different destinies. I tried to establish a connection by asking questions, asking about her life, but she just waved me off, often switching to the phone screen, ignoring me. Our relationship became increasingly strained. Every conversation, every attempt to establish communication felt like an attempt to penetrate a closed fortress, to which she did not have the key. And at some point, when we were sitting at the dinner table again, and I was trying to make fun of how our parents always praise her, and my achievements are nothing to them, I suddenly felt the tension in the air become almost tangible. I said it with a smile, as if joking, but an unbearable sense of injustice was growing inside me. Ruby looked up, her lips pursed slightly, and then she answered with a cold sharpness that startled me. "Do you always think that?" Her voice was firm and unbiased, as if she had accepted this truth for granted long ago. "You don't understand, Riley. You can't just figure out what I need. Do you think I don't notice that you feel like you're in the shadows? But this is not the case. You have no idea what I'm going through." I stopped talking. There was something in her eyes that made me step back. There was no pity or sympathy, just the cold truth, which she said with such calmness that it became difficult for me to breathe. We both fell silent, each lost in his own thoughts, and I did not know what to answer. I felt the wall between us growing, as if she was beginning to understand me, but couldn't, or wouldn't, accept me. We were both prisoners of our expectations, of our roles. I'm a loser, hers is a golden girl who's always been right. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't continue this game. I could no longer be the one who would always be in the background, who would always stand in the shadow of her successes. I decided it was time to go my own way, even if it meant being understood and accepted by far from everyone. From that moment on, our conversations became even less frequent. I continued to work, develop, and study, but not to prove anything to my parents or Ruby. I did it for myself because I knew that I deserved more than to remain in the background. Ruby was visibly agitated. I could feel it even without seeing her face. The atmosphere around the table began to change, as if the air was filled with her energy, strained like a string ready to break. She spoke in a loud, confident voice, as she always did when her merits became a topic of discussion. "Mom always says that I should come more often," she began, and I already knew what would happen next. She always started out like this, apologizing for not being able to spend more time with her family, but then she always went on to explain how difficult it was to combine her studies at such a prestigious university as hers. She always repeated how important it was, how difficult it was, how her medical program was incredibly complex, and that it all took effort. I didn't have to listen to her over and over again to understand how she structured her speech. She wanted everyone to understand how intense her life was, how important it was, and how hard it was for her to be in the middle of this vast, complex world. I can't just leave to relax at home, she continued, as if apologizing to us, but at the same time confirming that her duties were more important than our conversation, than our only time together. She often mentioned her group projects, which she said were extremely difficult and time-consuming. As always, I remained aloof, lost in thought. I wasn't offended, but rather tired of these conversations. Ruby has never understood what it means to be in a different position. She didn't understand that for me, for a man who fights for every opportunity, it's not that easy. My efforts were rarely noticed by anyone, and no matter how hard I tried to explain something, her world was so far from mine that it seemed pointless. The moment Ruby finished her speech, her voice rose even louder, as if she couldn't stop. She told everyone who was willing to listen about her academic achievements, how she influenced people, and how her mentors admired her diligence. I tried to listen to her again, but I could feel the tension building. Ruby's loud, confident words, her constant bragging, were familiar to our family. But it seemed to me that it would be too much for the neighbors and colleagues. Their faces did not express the delight that could often be seen in the eyes of our parents, and although they listened politely, I noticed a slight annoyance appear on their faces, barely noticeable, but not hidden. And then, as usual, one of the elderly neighbors, the one who always nodded affably and tried to keep up the conversation, decided to change the subject. He turned the conversation to me, to my career. "Riley, how are you doing in design?" he asked, and I felt a little better. I've long been used to the fact that my successes weren't as public as the Ruby's, but at least here was a chance to prove myself, and I could tell something about my efforts, about what I was doing. But as soon as I opened my mouth to reply, Ruby immediately cut me off. She didn't just interrupt, she seemed to snatch the conversation out of my hands, turning it in her direction, as she always did. Together, she and my parents started rejecting my attempts to talk about my career, and I felt my heart tighten with irritation. And not just from irritation, but from fatigue. Ruby, with her subtle hints about my small achievements, her insulting comparisons, as if I were an insignificant shadow against the background of her bright personality. I could hear it in her words, even though she never said it directly. But everything she said, everything she did, made it clear that in her eyes I was still the same insignificant Riley who had never been able to become as bright and successful as she was. I felt like the whole world was shifting around me, as if I was back in that moment when everything I did didn't matter, when every step I took seemed superfluous. Ruby and my parents have always been a united front, always supporting her, as if she were an exception to all the rules, and despite my attempts to be a good daughter, a good sister, my place has always remained somewhere on the sidelines, out of their attention. I knew Ruby didn't realize that. Her world was so consumed by her successes and her expectations that she didn't see that I was trying to find my way in this world by doing everything with my own hands. But it wasn't that important to them. In their eyes, I always remained in her shadow, and that look tormented me. This atmosphere, filled with Ruby's arrogant statements and incessant boasting about her success, couldn't help but generate a mixture of anger and disappointment in me. And the longer I sat in this stuffy, tense air, the more clearly I realized that all these years, like many others, had been part of a carefully constructed illusion. An illusion in which someone's efforts are valued only as echoes of other people's achievements, and mine simply disappear into an empty echo. And it wasn't just disappointment in Ruby, it was disappointment in the very idea of family, in the fact that we were always taught to support each other, but in fact all our efforts, my efforts, became just a reason for comparisons. They say Ruby is the perfect daughter, successful, smart. What about me? I was just the backdrop for her bright successes. When Ruby started telling everyone that it was difficult for her to spend time with her family because of her studies, When her voice at the table became so loud that it seemed to shake the walls, I felt anger boiling in my chest. With every word she said, it became more and more difficult for me to hide my inner protest. A protest against being ignored, a protest against the injustice that wrapped around our entire relationship like a spider's web. All these years I endured, closing my eyes, hoping that someday it would be different, but now I was ready to tell myself honestly, I can't live like this anymore. I've made a crucial decision. A few months after this meeting with my family, I broke off my relationship with them. It wasn't an easy decision. I thought for a long time, weighed everything, but in the end I realized that I could no longer stay in this cage, where I was constantly compared to Ruby, when my presence did not matter, when my efforts were not appreciated. It was painful, but I knew there was no other way. I could no longer afford to be a part of this drama, a part of their world that had never considered me as a person. But life didn't stand still, and a few months later Ruby unexpectedly contacted me. Her calls and messages began to arrive one after another, more and more insistently, as if she had suddenly decided that now I owed her something. Almost all of her messages boiled down to one request: to answer the phone, to talk, to sort things out, to help. I didn't block her number, although sometimes I thought I could. For a moment, I was annoyed. Why does she think I should be useful to her? Why did she suddenly need my answer? I picked up the phone with a bad feeling, but decided that at least once I could listen to what she had to say to me. When I picked up the phone, her voice immediately, almost panicked, burst into space. Haven't you forgotten about my training? I need to know, have you already paid for the year? Ruby's voice sounded strained, with notes of anxiety, but her words instantly gave me an unpleasant feeling. As always, she expected me to do anything for her, without even asking questions. I remembered how a few years ago, at the time of her admission to the university, I covered her entrance fee and made a donation at her enrollment, spending almost all of my savings. I helped her then, without hesitation, although, in fact, I couldn't afford it. I put not only money into it, but also emotions into it. And now, after a while, she called me again, as if I was obligated to cover her educational expenses without even consulting her. I remained calm so as not to let the free tone of her voice interrupt my own rhythm. Ruby, I paid the entrance fee and made a donation when you enrolled, you know that. But I'm not aware of the current year's payment, I replied cautiously. I tried not to give vent to the irritation that suddenly filled me. I didn't know about the subsequent requirements. Why hadn't she thought about it before? Why did she think I had to cover her expenses when she was barely making ends meet? I could hear her breathing getting heavy, and I realized that her concern wasn't just about money, but her own insecurity, which she was trying to hide behind a show of confidence. But I no longer needed to delve into her feelings. I was already too tired of all this, of how she manipulated me, how her problems became mine. I had my own life, my own worries, and I wasn't going to be a part of her world anymore, which had nothing to do with my values. Ruby, who called, clearly expected a different answer. She clearly thought that I would find a way to help, that I could be relied on, as it was before. But I didn't want to be her shadow anymore. I listened to her in silence, but the feelings of estrangement that had always been between us were now even more pronounced. It wasn't just the distance, it was the realization that I couldn't be a part of her world anymore if it stayed the way it was. I almost thought about forgiving her. Almost. When I heard her voice in the message, when she begged for help with her tuition fees, I felt old attachments start to pull me back. She said that she would be expelled without my help. There was concern in her voice, and her words that scholarships and part-time work were not enough hurt me. She wasn't trying to manipulate, but I felt that her request wasn't out of pity, but rather out of a sense of self-importance, saying, if not me, then who is it? She never admitted that all my efforts, all my savings spent on her education, did not lead to the proper result. But this time was different. She talked about how hard it was for her to combine her studies with work, and how she didn't have enough money to live. She even offered to mediate between me and my parents, saying that I could return home if I didn't feel like an unwelcome guest. Those words seemed to ignite a fire that I had been struggling to put out all these months. She was so careful to come up with ideas on how to smooth out the situation, not noticing that all my efforts were aimed not at being a part of her world, but at escaping from it. I couldn't take it anymore. This pathos, this game of caring, which she so skillfully played out, all this became more and more unbearable for me. I could not forgive her. I could not return to the world that was so alien to my real desires and aspirations. Saving her messages in a separate file, I put my phone aside. I sat in silence for a few seconds, thinking about what to do. And then, almost intuitively, I decided, that's it. It was the moment when I had to sever all ties. I deleted everything else from my phone, leaving only her message, and with cold determination, I sent her one last short message. Then I blocked her number. Without any explanations, without regrets. I couldn't continue this game anymore. Even if she was with her family, even if she was going through something important at that moment, I could no longer tolerate her condescending tone, her manipulations. This moment became the point of no return. I cut ties not only with Ruby, but also with my family. I finally and irrevocably decided that I could no longer be a part of this world in which I was not taken seriously. I started a new life, without looking back. At that moment, I felt a sense of liberation. With every step, with every new day, my life became clearer and clearer. I redirected my efforts to myself, to what was really important. I decided not to return home, not to seek reconciliation, not to engage in unnecessary explanations. My place was in another world, in another space, where my efforts are appreciated, where I can build my way without the pressure of other people's expectations. I soon found out that Ruby had been able to find the money to pay for her sophomore year. She achieved this with the help of other relatives, scholarships, and loans. But her efforts, as I expected, turned out to be short-term. She was unable to combine her stressful studies and work. All this just overwhelmed her, and she dropped out of university after 2 months. I can't say that I was surprised. She was always prone to overestimating her powers. And when Ruby called me in search of solace, trying to complain about how hard it was for her, despite my cold aloofness, supported her. I understood that her pain was real, that she was facing reality, and despite all our differences, I could not remain indifferent to her feelings. But it was no longer something that connected us as before. We'd become so different.